Good evening and welcome. I'm glad you're here. Wherever you are right now, let this be a small pocket of time that belongs only to you. You don't have to solve anything tonight or figure anything out. All you need to do is get comfortable, let your shoulders drop, and allow your breathing to soften. As you listen, you can imagine each sentence like a quiet step down a wooden path, leading you somewhere safe and warm. If your mind wanders, that's perfectly okay. Just return to the sound of the story, the way you might return to the gentle rhythm of water against shore. Now, when you're ready, let's begin. Late summer had settled into the day like a final golden layer of paint. And now, the evening came in clear and unhurried. The sky still held a trace of pale blue at its edges, but the center had deepened into a calmer shade, as if dusk were slowly turning a page. The air near the lake carried that particular freshness that arrives after a warm day, cooler than the garden, cooler than the road, touched by water and open space. A small cabin stood a little back from the shore, surrounded by pine trees that leaned toward it in quiet companionship. Their needles caught the last light and let it go again, as if the whole forest was breathing out. The cabin windows glowed warmly, and the inside looked like the kind of place where time naturally moved more slowly. The person who had come to rest here had arrived earlier with no urgency at all. There had been no big plan, no long list of things to do, just a simple intention to be somewhere gentle and to let the body remember how to soften. The drive had ended, the bag had been carried in, the door had been opened and closed, and then there had been a moment standing in the cabin's quiet when gratitude rose up in a steady, uncomplicated way. Now, the late evening felt like a gift being unwrapped carefully. The cabin was tidy and plain in the best sense. A wooden table, a few chairs, a couch with a folded blanket, shelves with well-loved mugs, and the quiet presence of a kettle waiting on the stove. A faint scent of pine lived in the wood itself, as if the trees outside had placed a hand on the cabin and left something reassuring behind. The person moved in an unhurried way, not because they were trying to be slow, but because there was no reason to be fast. They washed their hands at the small sink, feeling the cool water run over their fingers. They reached for a mug, thick ceramic, smooth on the rim, and set it on the table as if setting down a promise. Herbal tea felt like the right right companion for an evening like this. Nothing sharp or caffeinated, nothing that pulled the mind forward, just something that drifted along with the hours. They opened a small tin and breathed in the mild sweetness of dried herbs, maybe chamomile, maybe lemon balm, maybe a hint of mint. The scent rose softly, like a memory of summer fields warmed by sun. The kettle filled with a steady stream from the tap. The sound was simple and domestic, one of those small sounds that makes a space feel lived in. When the kettle was set on the stove, the metal made a gentle, familiar click against the grate. The flame turned on with a quiet hush, and the person leaned their hip lightly against the counter, waiting without impatience. Outside, the lake was almost still. Even from the cabin window, it looked less like moving water and more like a dark, polished surface, as if it had decided to become a mirror for the night. The wooden pier reached out from the shore like a calm gesture, simple and steady. Beyond it, the far bank was only a suggestion: trees and shadows and distance blending together. As the kettle warmed, the person let themselves notice the small comforts of the cabin. The floorboards had that gentle resilience beneath each step, and the air held a balance of warmth and coolness. The day's heat still faintly present in the wood, the evening's freshness gathering near the windows. Somewhere outside, a bird settled down for the night, its call brief and quiet, as if it didn't want to disturb anything. The kettle began to murmur, not quite boiling yet, just speaking softly in its own language. The person found a tea infuser and filled it with the dried herbs. The small pieces of leaves and blossoms looked fragile and light, like something meant to float. They placed the infuser into the mug and rested their hands around the ceramic for a moment, feeling its room temperature steadiness. When the kettle finally reached its boil, it didn't do so dramatically. It simply arrived there, as if it had been meant to. The person lifted it carefully, the handle warm in their palm, and poured the water in a thin stream. Steam rose in gentle curls, carrying the scent up toward the face. The herbs immediately released their color and fragrance, turning the water into something softly golden. They watched the tea bloom for a moment, the way the dried plants unfurled and swayed. There was something quietly mesmerizing about it, like watching a slow dance where no one is trying to impress anyone. They placed the kettle back, turned off the stove, and let the cabin returned to near silence. A light sweater lay draped over the back of a chair, and they slipped it on without thinking too much. The lake air, especially this late, always carried a touch of coolness that was more refreshing than cold. They wrapped their hands around the mug again, feeling warmth seep into their fingers, and took a small sip. The first taste was gentle. The tea didn't demand attention, it offered it. It tasted of calm plants and clean water, a softness that seemed made for late evenings. The warmth moved down the throat and settled in the chest like a small lantern. They carried the mug to the door and stepped out onto the porch. The night met them with clarity. The sky was cloudless, and the stars were beginning to show themselves more boldly now, as if they'd been waiting for the last traces of daylight to go. The air smelled like pine needles and cool earth, and somewhere nearby, the lake breathed out a faint, mineral freshness. A path led from the porch to the shore, and the person walked it slowly. The ground was still holding a little of the day's warmth, but the air around their ankles was cooler, a whisper of lake breeze. With each step, the sounds of the cabin fell behind, and the sounds of the shoreline came forward. The tiniest lap of water, the hush of leaves, the quiet presence of open space. At the edge of the lake, the wooden pier waited. It was simple, planks laid side by side, weathered to a pale gray in places, darker where water and time had deepened the grain. The posts rose from the water like steady sentinels, and the whole structure felt both sturdy and patient, as if it had been here long before anyone arrived to rest. The person set the mug down for a moment on a small bench near the start of the pier and slipped off their shoes. The ground touched the soles of their feet, cooler now, smoother where it had been worn by many summers. Then they stepped onto the pier. The wood beneath bare feet felt alive in a quiet way. It was firm, slightly textured, with the faint ridges of grain you could feel if you paid attention. Some boards were smoother, polished by footsteps and time. Others were rougher, holding the story of wind and sun. The pier held their weight without complaint, and the person let that steadiness travel up through ankles and legs, a reminder that they were supported. They picked up the mug again and began walking along the pier, slowly, listening to the soft, hollow sound of footsteps on planks. Each step felt like a small ritual. The air over the water was a degree cooler, and it brushed the skin with a light chill that felt clean rather than sharp. The scent of pine drifted in from behind them, layered with the lake's subtle smell, fresh, dark, and calm. Halfway down the pier, they stopped and looked out. The lake was nearly motionless, only the smallest tremor of movement near the posts, where water remembered to move. The surface reflected the sky like dark glass, and as the stars brightened overhead, their reflections began to appear below as well, tiny points of light, doubled, as if the sky had decided to lean down and look at itself. They took another sip of tea. The warmth in the mug pressed into their palms, and the heat rose into their face. The taste seemed even softer out here, as if the night air completed it. A faint breeze came and went, barely enough to stir the hair at the temples, and then everything settled again. The person listened. At first, it seemed like there was almost nothing to hear, and then the ear adjusted, the way eyes adjust to darkness. There was the tiniest sound of water touching wood, a quiet, repetitive kiss. There was the distant rustle of needles high in the pine trees, the way a forest speaks when it is trying not to wake anyone. There might have been an insect somewhere, making a soft, steady sound like a thread being pulled through fabric. Standing there, they felt their mind begin to unhook itself from the usual places. The day-to-day thoughts, messages, errands, plans were still somewhere in the background, but they no longer held the center. The center belonged to the pier, the tea, the stars, and the calm feeling of being exactly where they were. They walked to the end of the pier and sat down, letting their legs dangle over the edge. The wood was cool under their thighs through the fabric of their pants, and they placed the mug beside them, careful and steady. The lake below was dark and inviting in its stillness, not calling for action, only offering presence. Above them, the sky had deepened into a richer night. Stars were scattered with that effortless abundance that city lights often hide, and the person found themselves looking at them without naming any constellations. They didn't need to identify anything. They only needed to notice. Reflections shimmered faintly on the lake's surface. Each star had a twin below, slightly softened, as if the water were holding light in its own way. Now and then, a tiny ripple passed through, and the reflections wavered, then settled back into place, like a slow breath in and out. They placed their hands on the pier boards and leaned back slightly, feeling the wood's texture under their palms. There were small cracks, tiny grooves, places where the grain rose up like the edge of a gentle hill. The boards held the day's warmth just a little, but the lake air cooled them steadily, and that balance made the touch feel grounding. The scent of pine became more noticeable when the breeze shifted. It came in soft waves, carrying the memory of sunlit needles and resin, of bark warmed in afternoon light. It was the kind of smell that made the lungs feel more open, as if each breath created a little more space inside the chest. The person let themselves be grateful again, not in a dramatic way, but like someone putting a hand over a heart to feel it beating. Grateful for the cabin, for the simple mug, for the quiet. Grateful for the fact that rest was possible. That peace could be as ordinary as a wooden pier and a still lake. They took another sip of tea and felt the warmth spread. The mug was heavy enough to feel real, to keep the hands anchored. The tea was gentle enough to feel like permission. Steam rose and vanished into the night, the way thoughts sometimes rose and vanished when they were no longer needed. A light coolness gathered on their skin, mostly on the tops of their feet and along their forearms, where the air touched most easily. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was the coolness of water nearby, the coolness that tells the body it can settle under a blanket later and feel even cozier. The sweater did its quiet job, holding warmth close without making them too warm. They looked down at the lake's edge near the pier. The posts disappeared into water that was dark, but not opaque. It was dark like polished stone, dark like the inside of a pine forest at twilight. Occasionally, the surface shifted in a small, slow wave, and the reflected stars trembled as if blinking. The person began to notice how the mind behaves when it's given space. Thoughts still appeared small ones, gentle ones. A memory of sunlight on the road earlier. The feeling of carrying a bag into the cabin. Face of someone they cared about. But each thought arrived softly, stayed briefly, and then drifted away, like leaves floating past in a slow current. They didn't chase any thought. They didn't try to hold any thought. They simply watched them come and go, and the watching itself felt restful. It was like sitting by a window as clouds move across the sky. Nothing to fix, nothing to force, only motion that knows its own way. The pier creaked once, quietly, in the way wood does when it adjusts to temperature and time. The sound didn't interrupt the calm, it was part of it. The person smiled faintly, not because something funny had happened, but because the world felt companionable. Even the pier had its own small voice. They set the mug closer to their lap and wrapped both hands around it again. The ceramic was warm, and the warmth made their fingers feel looser. They noticed the way their shoulders sat lower than before, the way their jaw felt unclenched. They noticed the steady rhythm of breathing without trying to change it. Up in the sky, the stars seemed sharper now, the air clearer. The person let their gaze soften rather than focus tightly. When you soften your gaze, the world stops being a collection of separate things and becomes a single, quiet scene. The pier, the water, the trees, the cabin lights behind them, and the wide night above all belonged to the same gentle moment. The tea was slowly cooling, but it still carried a thread of warmth. Each sip was a small pause, a small punctuation mark in the silence. And between sips, the person listened again to the lake, to the almost sound of stillness. At some point, they realized they no longer needed to label the feeling in their chest. It wasn't excitement, and it wasn't anything complicated. It was simply a steady sense of being safe, being unhurried, being allowed to rest. The kind of feeling a body recognizes even if it can't explain. A faint mist hovered close to the water in the distance, barely visible, like the lake was wearing a thin veil. It didn't thicken or threaten. It simply existed, soft and quiet, adding another layer to the night's calm. The person watched it without thinking about it, the way you watch a slow candle flame. They imagined the cabin behind them, warm and waiting. They imagined the bed inside, the weight of a blanket, the simple pleasure of clean sheets. But they didn't rush toward those images. They let them be gentle suggestions, like the way the night suggests sleep without demanding it. The person set the mug down again and placed both hands flat on the pier, fingers splayed. The wood was cooler now, and the texture felt more pronounced against skin. They traced a line along the grain with one fingertip, slowly, feeling each tiny rise and dip, as if reading a story written in timber. Breathing in, they caught the pine scent again, mixed with something faintly sweet from the tea. Breathing out, they felt the night air leave their lungs without effort. In and out, slow and natural, like waves that were too small to be called waves. Their thoughts grew quieter, not all at once, but in stages. First, the louder thoughts moved to the edges. Then the smaller thoughts did too. What remained was more like sensation than thinking. The warmth in the palms, the coolness at the ankles, the steady support of wood, the open sky above. They looked at the reflections of stars again and noticed how the lake didn't reflect perfectly. It reflected kindly. It softened each point of light just enough to make it feel closer, more forgiving. The person found that comforting, the idea that even a mirror can be gentle. A small ripple traveled across the surface from somewhere far off, perhaps from a fish turning under the water, perhaps from a breeze that briefly remembered to exist. The ripple widened, reached the pier, and made the reflected stars tremble and stretch. Then it passed, and the stars returned to their places, calm and steady again. The person felt something similar happen inside. A small movement of thought, a tiny wave of feeling, and then a return to stillness. Nothing needed to be done about it. It could move through and pass, just like the ripple. They brought one knee up onto the pier and hugged it lightly, resting their chin on it for a moment. The posture felt childlike in the best way, simple, protective, comfortable. The sweater sleeves brushed their wrists, and the fabric felt soft against skin, cooled by night air. Time became less important out here. The person didn't know how long they had been sitting at the end of the pier, and it didn't matter. The night had its own pace, and their body had begun to match it. They finished the tea in small sips until the mug was nearly empty. The last mouthful was cooler, but still pleasant, carrying the faint taste of herbs and comfort. When they swallowed, they felt as if the warmth had moved inward, settling somewhere deeper than the stomach, like a quiet, lasting glow. They stayed a little longer anyway, even without the tea. The mug, empty now, still held a trace of warmth, and they held it like a small stone warmed by sun. They looked at the sky one more time, letting their gaze drift from one cluster of stars to another without trying to make meaning. In the distance, the shoreline was a dark curve. The trees were silhouettes, but the person knew their shapes. The tall pines, the softer outlines of other summer trees. The cabin light was a warm square behind them, not bright enough to disturb the night, only bright enough to promise comfort when they returned. Eventually, the person stood. They did it slowly, letting their feet find the pier again. The boards felt cool and familiar under bare soles, the grain pressing gentle patterns into skin. They picked up the mug and began walking back along the pier, each step a soft thud, each step a quiet farewell to the lake's mirror. Halfway back, they paused one last time, not because they needed to, but because it felt natural to offer the night a moment of appreciation. They breathed in pine and water and late summer air, and they breathed out whatever was left of the day. Then they continued to shore. The cool ground met their feet again, and they slipped their shoes back on without hurrying. The path to the cabin was dim but clear, lit by the sky and the cabin window. The person walked as if they had all the time in the world. Inside, the cabin greeted them with warmth. The air felt stiller here, and the wood seemed to hold the day's last gentle heat. They set the mug in the sink and rinsed it lightly, watching water swirl and disappear down the drain. The sound was soft and domestic again, like a small lullaby of everyday life. They turned off the brighter lights and left only a small lamp glowing. Shadows softened in the corners, and the cabin became even cozier, as if it too were preparing for sleep. The person moved through the space slowly, touching the back of a chair, smoothing a hand along the edge of the table, feeling the simple reality of things. In the bedroom, the bed waited with a neatly folded blanket and pillows that looked kind. The person changed into something comfortable. The fabric against skin felt like another permission to rest. They opened the window just a little, letting in a thread of cool lake air, so the room carried both warmth and freshness. They lay down, not collapsing into the mattress, but settling into it. The bed supported them in the same way the pier had: steady, quiet, reliable. The blanket came up over the body, and warmth gathered around shoulders and chest. From here, they could still hear the lake if they listened. It was faint now, filtered through walls and distance, but present. A soft hush, a tiny lap, a reminder that the water continued being water, calm and steady, reflecting stars, whether anyone watched it or not. The person let their eyes close. In the darkness behind eyelids, the reflections of the lake seemed to appear again, points of light softly trembling, then smoothing out. The smell of pine lingered in the room, subtle but reassuring, threaded through the night air coming in through the cracked window. Thoughts tried gently to line up into sentences. A plan for tomorrow, a memory, a question. But each one loosened before it could tighten. Each one dissolved like steam from tea, rising and vanishing without leaving a trace. Breath moved in and out. The body became heavier, then lighter, then uncomfortably heavy again, as if it were finding the perfect resting place within itself. The mind, no longer needing to hold onto anything, began to drift. The last clear image was simple: the wooden pier under bare feet, the cool grain and steady boards, the almost still water holding stars like tiny lanterns. And then even that image softened at the edges. The pier became an idea of steadiness. The lake became an idea of calm. The stars became an idea of gentle light. And then the ideas, too, faded thoughts thinning into quiet, quiet thinning into nothing in particular, until there was only the smooth, warm dark, and a feeling like being held by night itself, with no need